Good afternoon and welcome to this Africa webinar, lunch webinar that we are really happy to host Assistant Professor Bert Ingelaere from the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp. For those of you who don't know his work, he has written quite extensively on the Great Lakes region and on Rwanda more specifically. He has conducted a lot of field research in Rwanda, more than 40 months of field research in the Great Lakes region. He has also been awarded quite a lot of prizes. His work was awarded the Auschwitz Foundation Award, and his book Inside Rwanda's Gacaca Courts won the 2017 Bethwell A. Ogot Book Prize. Today he will speak about how to rebuild trust after genocide, which falls into his larger research theme about violence, what happens after mass violence and how to rebuild trust more generally. And for those of you who are new to the Africa Program's webinar, my name is Nina Willen and I'm the director for the Africa Program at the Egmont Institute. And we organize these types of webinar more or less once or twice per month. And today then it's Bert Ingelaere's turn. And he will talk about his research that he has done with more than, which is based on more than 500 life story interviews in Rwanda, spanning from before the genocide up to 17 years after it. So the way that we go about these types of webinars is that the speaker talks for about 30 minutes or so, and then we have 30 minutes for Q&A. You can ask questions throughout the presentation in the chat or the Q&A box that you can see on the bottom of your screen, and then I will read them out loud to Bert after his presentation. So please feel free to write the questions during the presentations and we will take them up in the Q&A afterwards. So I think that we have most attendees who have signed in. So Bert, I will give you the floor and you have about 30 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina. I hope everyone can hear and see me. Thank you very much for the generous introduction. Let me try to share my screen with my presentation. Yes, okay. So I think you see my, yeah, you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
All right. Okay, thank you, Nina, for the introduction again, and thanks everyone for joining. So indeed, my talk will be about trust, following or trying the evolution of trust after mass violence, and more particular after the genocide in Rwanda. And of course, this enters in the broader theme of post-conflict reconstruction, where we know that violence destroys infrastructure, of course, human capital. And in the wake of that, of course, buildings can be rebuilt and there is new generations of people and all kinds of policies addressing the legacy of violence. But actually, one of the things that is most important, and that is also one of the motivations of my research, is that we don't know a lot about the social and institutional legacies of conflict and of violent conflict. These are probably the most important, but the least understood impacts of war, of violence. And that is the motivation underlying quite a few different types of research that I'm doing, not only in Rwanda, of course. And here in particular, regarding the social legacy, I'm going to focus on the question of trust. And when I say trust, then I mean interpersonal trust. Of course, there are different dimensions of trust. There is trust between citizens and government, but that's not what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the interpersonal trust that resides, and I'll develop this more during my talk, in a sort of personal predisposition, something that you have or acquire in early life, or through very traumatic or very intense experiences through the life course. And then it resides, of course, also in the nature, the experience of trustworthiness in social interactions. So how does this change? Of course, we know or we assume that this is impacted by violence. And of course, the Rwanda, the genocide against Tutsi is a very, well, it's a hard case to call it like that, because, and I'll return to that later as well, a genocide, ultimately violence has a communicative function. It sends a message, and different types of violence send different types of messages. Actually, in a war, you don't want to destroy the population, you actually want to control, you want to govern that population. But a genocide, the message of a genocide is that you don't foresee any future social interactions with the targeted group. So ultimately, this is the strongest or the most intimate attack on social trust, on social relations. And the Rwandan case is, of course, also very peculiar. And I think most of you are familiar with the Rwandan case, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it happened in the context of a civil war, and primarily in the months of April, July 1994, where approximately, according to scientific studies, the estimate is that there was 75% of the Tutsi population killed. Some of these numbers are disputed. The government puts it at 1 million. But what is also very peculiar is that there was a high involvement of ordinary civilians. Normally, in questions or in situations of genocide, it are the specialists in violence, militia, soldiers, who do the killing, which was also the case, of course, in Rwanda. But through a number of dynamics, it was possible to mobilize the ordinary population to be involved in the killing of their neighbors. And of course, again, the question after that is then these trust relations, how have they been affected between these people? And how are they evolving over time? So this is basically the basic situation in Rwanda. People live dispersed on the hills. And actually what you see the pictures, you have the ladies at the top, and they are genocide survivors. So they survived the genocide, they were targeted in the genocide. And they were killed by the man that you see in the middle there in the picture at the bottom. On the left, that's me, or at least a younger version of myself. And the right, that's one of my translators. But the situation is like this. This man actually was involved in the killing of the children of these ladies, but now they live together again. There is no other option. They have not the possibility to move. Well, of course, some did, but ultimately they, because of poverty and other reasons, they need to try to live together again. So that is the basic situation for many people in Rwanda, and of course in other countries as well, who have experienced a similar situation. Now, what does the literature, so to speak, say about this legacy? And actually, regarding trust, and there is no real consensus. There are lots of things that we don't really know. For instance, one of the problem is that it is important, in order to understand what the evolution is, that you need to look at the relevant groups in society. You cannot, look at society as such, but you also especially need to see what have been the groups that have been targeted, and what are the relations of people belonging to these groups. The assumption is there that the violence increases the sense of belonging, the trust towards your own group, and decreases the trust towards the outgroup. So it's important to look at the relevant categories. In this case, also in Rwanda, this is of course the question of Hutu and Tutsi. So the questions need to be asked: is there indeed a decrease of trust towards the other group, and maybe an increase of trust towards your own group, or the group where you identify with? Another problem is that, as I've already said, violence has a communicative function, and different types of violence have different types of communications, have different types of impact. There is a difference between war and genocide. Genocide is actually destroying social relations, so the assumption can be there that also, if you experience that, that there must be a higher impact maybe regarding these relationships of trust, and also more difficult to recover. So does the type of violence matter, and does what kind of experience you had with that type of violence, does that matter? We don't know a lot about that. And another problem is that when studies are done, or the things that we know, it's based on a particular observation and a particular moment in time. But trust evolves, and earlier it might have been different, and later it might be different as well. So the underlying question is, does time play a role? Does time heal the wounds? So what is the time dimension? Now, the way I approached it is try to develop a systematic approach starting from these knowledge gaps and addressing them in order to answer whether, how much, for whom, and how persistent these things are changing. And most importantly, why or why not? And what can we learn from the drivers of these changes in trust? Now, I'm not going to develop this in detail, but I need to give you a sense of, let's say, the methodology behind the findings, or the methodology that was developed. Now, I collected 468 life stories in Rwanda with 468 people, which is actually quite large. Normally, people working with life stories, they collect a few stories. But for a number of reasons, to deal with these knowledge gaps, I wanted to have this done in a systematic way, which also where I applied, which also is a bit different, selected a variation of places where you see on the screen, and the black dots are the places that were selected. So there is a variation, and because the genocide was not as intense in all the places, and there were different experiences in different places. And in these places, based on certain indicators, we stratified the sample. Of course, and I know identifying people based on ethnicity in Rwanda is quite sensitive. So we used other categories, which you can ask, for instance, being a survivor or a returnee. And then during the interview, we also, and people are actually quite open to talk about it, and they say whether they self-identified as Hutu or Tutsi, currently or in the past, given that the policy surrounding that has changed. Another aspect is, of course, it's the telling of the story, but another thing we developed is using a ladder. And everybody understands the idea of a ladder. You can go up or down. So we use this, and you also see it on the picture, for the respondents to tell us what is your level of trust towards people of your own group, people of your own ethnicity, and people of the other ethnicity. And then to indicate whether they're on the positive side, the negative side, and what degree. And for each year in their life, they had to indicate what level they would situate themselves on. And then also give a reason, if there are changes, what are the reasons, which we then could afterwards code to come to a higher notions. Now we did this with, because we wanted to have people to have lived consciously through this episode of violence, through the experience of the genocide. So they had to have been 18 years old before the start of the Civil War. And we first collected the first rounds in 2007. And then in 2011, I did this again with the same people to have an update, but also for methodological reasons that I'm not going to explain now, but it comes with all kinds of methodological issues regarding social desirability, recall questions, but all of this has been checked, that there is actually no biases coming out of the approach. So let's move to the results, whether, how much, for whom, and how persistent. Of course, linking it back to the questions, so what happened with trust, and what happened with inter-ethnic trust and intra-ethnic trust, and is there a difference depending on the type of experience, and how is this evolving over time? Now, this is not what I'm going to explain, but I just wanted to evoke the complexity of the dynamics depending on how you're going to look at it. But based on the material that comes out of, well, the data, you see the scale from +/5 to -5. So you can aggregate people in groups according to certain characteristics, and then you can plot it over time. And depending, there is all kinds of differences that are emerging. But this is more obvious, of course. This is more easier to understand graphically as well. So this is for all respondents, the evolution of their self-reported trust over time. And this at the top here, this is where trust inter-ethnic. This is the inter-ethnic line, and this is the intra-ethnic line. How it was before the start of the Civil War, and you see, of course, during the Civil War and the polarization that is going on and leading to the genocide in 1994, especially inter-ethnic trust reaches a low point, and then it slowly starts to recover over time. This is for all respondents taken together. But of course, as I said, it is important to look at the relevant categories in the conflict, in the experience of genocide, those who were targeted and those who have been involved in the targeting as well. And therefore, we differentiate according to whether the respondents have identified themselves as being Hutu or Tutsi. And this is the panel or the graph where you see inter-ethnic trust, so trust towards people of the other ethnic group, and intra-ethnic trust, so the trust that they experience over time towards people of their own ethnicity. Also here you see the tremendous impact for both groups inter-ethnically during the Civil War already, and of course the extreme low point, especially for people of Tutsi ethnicity that were targeted in the genocide in 1994. Also here you see a gradual recovery. The time dimension is important. What you also see is that this is not a linear, let's say, evolution. It goes up and down. So there is responsiveness to certain policies, and I will return to that in a minute. Yeah. Also important to note here regarding intra-ethnic trust that also declined very much for Hutu, of course, because during the genocide and in that period of violence, there were also quite some Hutu targeted by Hutu. Of course, the majority were Tutsi, but the violence was more complex than that. Now, what does it say at this point regarding our questions? What we definitely see is that indeed the genocide has a tremendous impact on the trust towards people of the other category. We don't see a lot of increase in, let's say, the trust for people of your own category. And what we do see is that the time dimension does matter. But there is a recovery. Time does seem to heal the wounds, but the recovery is incomplete. We don't go back to the levels as it was before the conflict. Another aspect is that you also see, depending on what moment you would be looking, you would have different situations of the recovery, different levels of trust. Let's have a look at the remaining questions regarding the type of violence and whether the type of the experience with the type of violence actually matters. So here I differentiate within the group of Tutsi, people belonging to the Tutsi ethnicity. We can differentiate whether you are a survivor or whether you were a returnee. So in the context of Rwanda, survivors, rescapés, means that these are people who actually were inside Rwanda and have been targeted during the genocide, whereas Tutsi returnees are people who lived outside of Rwanda, and they had been refugees before, and only returned to Rwanda after the genocide. So what you see there is also actually for both the tremendous impact of the polarization and then the genocide itself. But what is quite remarkable is that here, Tutsi returnees who have not directly experienced the violence, their trust recovery is quite different and is quite positive after 17, 18 years compared to the people that have actually experienced the violence themselves who were inside Rwanda. At the level of intra-ethnic trust, there is not much, that is visible there. But it shows that whether or not you have experienced that violence yourself continues to have a long-term impact over the years regarding the levels of trust that you experience towards people of the other ethnic group. I've done the same, but on the side of Hutu, trying to find an indicator of the experience of violence in relation to the genocide. And here I managed to identify people within the sample who were actually convicted for having committed crimes of genocide, not pillaging, or we left out people actually convicted for pillaging, but based on the records of the Gacaca courts, to which I will return in a minute, that was the mechanism that had to identify who had been involved in the genocide or not. It was possible to identify people who were convicted by the courts for having been involved in crimes against humans. Also there, you see people who have not been convicted, the levels of trust, well, they are low as well, but especially for the Hutu who have been convicted, they were quite low. And then there is a gradual recovery. The problem here, the causality is difficult to establish because actually the fact that they were already less trusting Tutsi might have been the reason that they were involved. Another reason might be that the experience of having committed violence might be the reasons that these trust levels, although they increase over the years, but are quite different from the people who have not been involved in the genocide. Another aspect regarding the different types of violence, one of the things we could also identify, you see the red line here again, these are Tutsi respondents who have experienced the genocide. Well, it's a combination of survivors and returnees. But of course, as we know, the genocide happened in the context of civil war, and there were also other revenge killings afterwards that happened towards Hutu. So that we could also identify not at the individual level, but at the regional level. We could diversify depending on whether this is people who live in a region where massacres against Hutu actually happened. But you see, this is quite different. So this is violence, in my opinion, that happened during the civil war and where the aim was to control the population. And this is quite different from the experience of genocide, which is a different type of violence, which you see here emerging in the experience of people of Tutsi ethnicity. But it needs to be noted that also the levels of trust here, whether or not you lived in a region with a massacre, continues to be different later on, or so many years later. So to go back to our questions, so we already identified a few, but indeed it does matter what type of violence you have experienced, whether it was genocide or both on the side of victims, but potentially also on the side of perpetrators, and whether you have experienced that violence yourself or not. And it's not whether you were part of or experienced polarization, but it is the real experience of violence that matters. Now, these are trends, but of course the question is why? Why these types of trends? And as I already indicated, there are two perspectives on the foundations of trust. And trust resides in a personal predisposition. It's something you have that you acquired in early life, or it is something that develops mainly to very intense experiences, trauma, of course, that changes these predispositions. Another aspect is that it resides in how people qualify the trustworthiness of social interactions. So ultimately, the evolving nature of trust relations resides in a complex combination of, well, these personal predispositions, which can be trauma, which means, and I'll show that in a minute, that people remain distrustful due to the experience they have and they are not able to overcome. But there is also the aspect of what is called personal growth, which is actually the flip side or the opposite of trauma, that due to these intense experiences, people become, for instance, more pro-social, starting to trust people more, starting to be more, politically active due to this experience of violence. So there is an entire literature emerging there. Another aspect is that it has to do, of course, with changes in society's infrastructure. Now let's develop this a bit more. One of the things I can also do is to divide people in a matrix, the respondents, and then, for instance, if they have identified that at the year of the genocide, they were -5, so the lowest level. And some of them, so many years later, they are still -5, so they are stuck in mistrust. But many others, or at least many others, are somewhere in between, But some actually went from -5, the lowest levels of inter-ethnic trust, to the highest levels of inter-ethnic trust. And then we could read these cases or analyze these cases in more depth, and dividing it whether you're a survivor or other types of characteristics. And if you look at these narratives, what is emerging is that, of course, this continued trauma, this experience of trauma, I'm not a psychologist, but ultimately trauma has to do with unable to update the information. So you continue to see the world as you saw it during the traumatic experience, despite changes in the context. You're not unable to cognitively see the world also differently. Isolation, no contacts, negative contacts, these are the things that, or the experience of negative contacts, of course. These are the reasons why that are emerging out of the stories of these people, why they continue to be so distrustful towards others, and especially inter-ethnic others, people of the out-group. But of course, we can also learn from resilience, the people who, in an exceptional way, go from the lowest levels of trust to the highest levels of trust. And what you see there is, contrary to people who are unable to change their view of the world, is that due to new information, they're able to differentiate between a larger category, the Hutu as such, or the Tutsi as such, and start to see people again as an individual, and not as a larger entity that one needs to distrust. And this is combined with the end of isolation, the start of a more positive type of contact. And that's often what you see, working together, the fact that it's almost the everyday rituals where people actually start to interact again with each other in a positive way, that increases the trust between them. It might also be more institutionalized, such as, for instance, as is mentioned here, mixed agricultural associations where people have to work together for a common goal and start to see each other in a different way. Sometimes of one dimension also, of course, is related to sensibilization programs. So personal predispositions that is emerging from these narratives and the experience of trustworthiness in social interactions. Now, to examine especially the latter part a bit more, the changes in the societal infrastructure. One of the things we can do is, again, identify the changes over time. And in this graph, you see above 0, that's actually all positive changes that people report. And this is the trend line that you see here, the net change. But below 0, these are the negative changes that people report. Of course, this is the equivalent of the genocide. But what you see here, the reported changes, is not linear. So it's a time element, but it's not simply a question of time. And there are moments, apparently, as a reaction towards policies, that the changes are negative. And it's important to understand these policies, what policies work and what do not work. Of course, if we zoom in and link it to the narratives, and of course the events that people, the context, the negative changes here is immediately after the genocide. There is lots of imprisonment, there are revenge killings, many people flee to Congo. So the situation is still very, well, the negative experience of social relations, of the societal infrastructure. Now, this changes dramatically in the year 2000 for the case of Rwanda. And this, of course, has to do with especially that there was still an insurgency war going on, especially in the north of Rwanda. And of course, the experience of war is a negative experience also in the social interactions. It comes, especially since it's an insurgency and a counterinsurgency war, it comes with lots of suspicion in the population. At the same time, near the end of the 90s, there is this, for the first time, because initially this was not the case, the introduction of the notion of unity or reconciliation as unity in public discourse. This also, of course, starts to change the way people interact with each other. Over the years, there are other events. You have the presidential elections, release of prisoners. And then, importantly, in 2005, the Gacaca courts are introduced. Gacaca is actually the system that Rwanda introduced to deal with the legacy of genocide, had several objectives, and actually I've written an entire book about it, which Nina already evoked. But what you see there, the introduction of the Gacaca, which was also one of the objectives was to bring reconciliation. You see that the experience for quite a number of people is negative. And this is, of course, not unexpected. If we, or better, we need to qualify how Gacaca actually worked. The point is that people started accusing each other of what they had done in the genocide or denying that they had done something. And of course, this created in the social relations initially, especially in the first phase where people were not able to defend themselves, quite some tensions, which was also visible in other reports, which then actually when the trials took off and when they ended, especially got better. So if we examine this a bit more, here you see again above zero are positive evolutions and the coded reasons why there are positive changes, and below zero are the negative changes. And you see that inter-ethnic trust is quite responsive to this Gacaca experience, with the introduction both negative and positive report, and then ultimately over time it gets better. So initially I was was testifying and I thought they would kill me. Gacaca clarified things. We have noted, so Gacaca also came to clarify, to differentiate. Often for survivors, they survived for a reason, namely because they were in hiding often, and they don't really know, unless of course their very personal experience, who might have been involved and who did not. Through Gacaca, some of these things became more clear, and they did not fear the entire group anymore. And not only, again, this is a mixed, let's say, result of Gacaca, and especially also the end of Gacaca, what many people evoke, and that there, because of that, social relations actually got better. Now, to move to the conclusion, I think, yes, we get a sense of the evolution of trust in Rwandan society, interpersonal trust over time, the fact that it is indeed a remarkable positive evolution given the intensity of what they have experienced, but that there are quite some, let's say, things we might not know, people who continue to linger on are deeply distrustful. So to have a few conclusions, of course, what we saw, this huge decline in inter-ethnic trust and then a gradual recovery. Yes, time heals the wounds, but there is no complete recovery. And the question is, will there ever be? And is it even possible that you can reach the levels, especially for the people who went through this experience of genocide, whether they can again be or experience that in the same way as they did before that experience? So in any case, and this is the most obvious suggestion, of course, prevention is key. You see the effort that is needed, the time it takes to heal the wounds, the scars on the social tissue. And even more important, what is the, and we also know that in the Great Lakes region, and the cycle of conflict and things that happened in the past that continue through memory to generate maybe conflict in the future. And what is quite important, I think, there is not this generation that I focused on, who actively went through this experience, but the second generation. How does this trust and these ideas of trust, how is it passed on from their parents to descendants? Another aspect is that trust is quite responsive to major political events, transitional justice mechanisms, policies that profoundly affect the social tissue. So yes, these things work, but be aware they can be positive or negative. So one of the things that we saw, for instance, with the experience of Gacaca, some of these things, although they have been designed to create positive contact, ultimately create negative contact. So contact is an important aspect. What you see that people say it by grouping people together in associations, that's what they experience as positive context and where trust is actually increasing. But we need to be aware that especially the type of exposure, and we've seen that with survivors, can be very different based on the experience and the type of violence. It's also important if you devise policies to be aware of these differences and identify the relevant categories. Otherwise, you do things for people who don't need it and might overlook people who actually need specific, let's say, attention or so different types of violence, different experiences with that violence require different interventions. And you see the lasting effect overall. And I think that's one of the things, and that trauma healing cannot be underestimated. Until this day, of course, trust is not exactly the same as trauma, but you see that the reasons why trust is not recovery has to do with precisely these changes in the predispositions of people. And also in the case of Rwanda, there has been quite some attention to all kinds of mechanisms, but I'm wondering whether also the mental health issue, I think in more recent years, that there is more attention to that. So I'm going to conclude here. Well, at least part of what I presented here is also available in an academic article. Maybe you don't have access to it, so you can drop me an email and I can send it to you. There is also something we wrote based on this material in a more accessible format last year in African Arguments. And some of it is still work in progress. So thank you for your attention. I think that there are probably a few questions and that Nina will now take over. Shall I close the PowerPoint again?
Yes, yes, you can. Thank you so much for this presentation, Bert. I think that everybody is finding this fascinating. It's not just a presentation that's fascinating. It's the material that you have. That's just a unique material. And throughout your presentation, I was thinking about two aspects of it, which I think are aspects that you were focusing a lot on the difference between war and genocide, which I think is quite interesting. How both the violence is different and how it affects policies afterwards and how it affects societies afterwards. As you say, that war is about controlling population, when genocide is actually about not being any interaction between the populations or different groups in the population afterwards. And I think that's an aspect which sometimes is overlooked when you talk about the difference between genocide and war. So I found that really interesting. And I also think about the timing, how you're showing the evolution with time about how trust, it's as you said, it's not a linear experience, but it goes up and down depending on the different policies. And then you also showed how some policies may not have the expected reactions or expected effects until later, as you talked about the gachacha, which I also found super interesting. I was just thinking if you could, before I go into more in-depth questions, for those of the audience who are not familiar with what a life history interview is, perhaps you could just explain that very briefly. What type of questions are you asking, and how did it actually happen when you went back to, so you've been there several times and you interviewed the same person, and could you see any difference, and what type of questions are you asking? And then another question, it's about this whole process that you've been going through. And this is part of one of the questions from the audience, but also my own question. What would you say, some of the findings that you have, I would say that that's expected findings, that the trust is going down during genocide and then that it's gradually going up. But what would you say are the most surprising findings that you've had throughout this research? What has surprised you as a person? And then for you as a researcher, how has it affected you over these years? Because you've been into, I know that you've been sitting through quite a lot of gachacha trials as well. So you've been hearing a lot of things throughout these past decades, actually. How has this affected you? And have you changed in some ways during these years in the way that you have approached the topic and the way that you've learned from it? maybe that was quite a few questions, but let's start with that and then I'll take more from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Nina. Very, very interesting questions. To start with the life history interview, as I try to avoid, I mean, first there are 1001 ways, because by doing this research, I actually did a survey of, or I did a review of all types of life history that exist, or ways of doing life histories, and there are actually 1001 ways of doing it, and but ultimately it's the basic approach is that a person tells his or her story, and this can be very open, and you leave it mostly to the respondents to decide. In this, let's say, approach I adopted is I wanted to make it quite systematic, and so the use of the letter makes it quite systematic and makes the maybe the interview also a bit quite structured. But ultimately, regarding the types of questions, so the interviews were divided in a number of sections, and so we initially started with simply the demographic information and all the major events or all the major changes in a person's life that they would list themselves. But going from there, they were born, marriage, and then of course experiences such as the genocide, being a refugee, and then we moved systematically to a number of themes, and trust was actually one of them. We also asked about other themes, and there it were the years that we were asking very open-ended questions, but of course structured regarding a number of themes. So asking about inter-ethnic trust, saying okay, and then we would say because people, especially people living in the hills, they don't know 1997, what was that? And in the meantime, we knew that, let's say the person had said 1996 was when I was married, then we would say 1 year after your marriage. And so you had to develop a sort of a way of, and I did quite some pilots to see what would be the best way before I actually systematically did it. So it's a combination of my approach, structuring it, but at the same time, and that's the strength of the life history format, leaving it quite open so that the reasons and the narratives of the people themselves can emerge. Expected findings. There is some of the things, as you mentioned, are quite expected, of course, and the fact that the tremendous drop, but still it's good that you can prove it somehow or visualize it. Unexpected findings. Personally, I was a bit surprised by the difference that you see there between genocide survivors and returnees. In the case of genocide survivors, it's understandable, but that there is this fast recovery for returnees who actually also lived outside of Rwanda, and that's one of the findings that I consider quite surprising and also quite interesting. It shows also that you cannot lump people in these big categories that we use. There are a few others, of course, but I would need to think about it. Let's move to your other question. Well, how has it affected me? Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, well, maybe on the surface, have I changed, or have I learned from it? So, of course, it's one of the approaches that I've been there quite some time and went back and to the same people. These are very sensitive issues for them, of course. And it's also important, in order for people to speak freely, that they trust you. And it's by going there for so many years. And also in these places, as you said, I observed all the gacaca trials going on. So it's important, that's not only in Rwanda, but in any situation where this happened. This is a situation of distrust already between them, but also towards outsiders. And so it's important to develop this trust, so that regarding myself personally, of course, indeed, as you say, that what people talk about, but also in the trials, it's all about extreme violence. Personally, somehow you're mentally prepared to hear these things, and actually while you're doing it, yeah, you somehow, if you take more technical mindset to it, it's doable. But you see, and especially when you return, of course, that somehow this has a larger impact, also over time. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And while you're talking, there are coming a lot of new questions. So I'll take a few of them, and you pick and choose if there are some that you prefer to jump. One question is about the effects that it has had in neighboring countries, and how the genocide spillover effects in the DRC and Burundi, and how you see that, if it's had, what type of effects it had in the neighboring countries. And also, you mentioned the impact of the Gacaca process on trust levels in Rwanda, but did your study also look at the impact of the Ictr trials on trust levels? So Ictr, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And then another question, I'll take one more. Do you know if or how the Gacaca are narrated to the younger generations within Rwanda, beyond the memorial's official narratives, to ensure their opinion of them remains positive and that they continue to trust the process that took place? And I take one more. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, so if you could go into a little bit more into detail about the kind of programs that can support trust recovery. In particular, does it make a difference whether the focus is on community level activities or national level or state-led initiatives? So the different levels, how low, how decentralized do they need to be to actually, if you can see an effect at the different levels? So feel free to pick and choose, because we have quite a few more questions after that.
Okay, but maybe to clarify, the first question was the effect of genocide on other countries, right?
Yes.
In the general sense, or regarding trust, or?
So the question is, why are we not talking about the Rwandan genocide in Burundi and the DRC? And it says that the genocide has gone over the borders to the DRC. Why are we not talking about a genocide in the DRC or in Burundi?
Well, I of course completely agree that, you know, the genocide had a tremendous regional impact due to, of course, the refugees situations and the continuation of the Rwandan conflict in the Congo, of course. But that's currently not my focus. So I only focused on, well, the people living inside Rwanda, of which, of course, some of them had been outside. But I agree that the genocide had a tremendous impact on neighboring countries in various of ways, and that violence that took on, I mean, you need to look at the Rwandan conflict as not as a sort of a monolithic event, but an event where there were different types of violence in different phases, and also in different countries, like in the DRC, it continued but morphed into something else. Regarding the impact of the Ictr on trust levels, I didn't systematically check it, but the approach is quite open. So if there was an impact, it would have surfaced. But to be honest, of course, doing the research on the Gacaca, I also acquired or looked into that a little bit. And in my opinion, especially for ordinary people living in the countryside, the impact of the Ictr is completely zero. They have no idea what is going on, and sometimes they hear someone being convicted. They don't care. They don't know how it works. It's psychologically and physically very distant to them. It has very little impact on, especially regarding social relations, on their social relations. The Gacaca narratives on the younger generation, it's a good question, and that's why I also raise it, but I don't have any answer. So the next step, I think, maybe for myself as well, is do this type of research precisely with the younger generation, For the some people are doing that, but for the moment, it's only anecdotal what I know. So I don't want to pronounce myself on it. So I don't know what narratives are there, but what I do know is that ultimately that younger generation is going to be very important, of course, in regarding the legacy of these experiences. Regarding the programs, how decentralized should they go? Well, I think they should be quite decentralized. I think underlying lots of these trends, of course, they need to work at several levels. But I think ultimately what you see emerging in it's contact. It's really physical contact that is being facilitated. Of course, that can be done in many ways, starting with the discourse that is being developed at the political level almost. But ultimately, putting people really together, then of course, these are very, the facilitation of almost, of course, some of these things can be done informally. You don't need a program for that. But some of these programs, I think, should go quite deep. That's why you see also the Gacaca was a really decentralized program where everybody was involved, but in the case of Gacaca with a bit of a mixed outcome regarding this contact.
Yeah, you've got quite a few questions about the second generation and how if there has been an intergenerational transmission between the ones who have experienced the genocide and the ones who haven't, but who have heard from their parents or families, and how that has an impact on the level of trust. And then
but I already answered that. I also find it very interesting, but I cannot give you any systematic insights.
But will you continue to do interviews on that, do you think?
With the second generation?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm quite interested. That's one of the things I would like to do as a follow-up. Basically, because actually I'm not only doing this research, I've not only done this research in Rwanda, but I also did exactly the same thing in Burundi, which is a very similar society, but dynamics are quite different. But I didn't develop this now, and it's still work in progress to develop this comparison more. But the next step, what I'm interested in, is precisely a follow-up, ideally starting from these individuals, because then I can link the situation of their parents to what the situation of the children is. But whether and how, or if I'm going to do it, I don't know.
There is definitely reason to invite you again, that's for sure. A few more questions. You mentioned the particularity of the genocide context with regards to conflict impact on trust. In what way would you expect the evolution of trust levels to be different in more traditional civil war contexts? For instance, may the nature of relations between civilians and armed groups, or the degree of embeddedness of armed groups in local communities, differently impact trust levels? So basically, how the difference between war, civil war, and genocide, like the type of violence. Another question was someone who's wondering about what you can say about the impact of trauma healing processes or activities by Rwandan civil society actors. For example, by Never Again Rwanda or the Rwandan Quaker community. Did you happen to interview people who participated in trauma healing or peace building activities? And if so, did you notice any difference?
Okay. So regarding the difference between war and genocide, yes, I mean, it would be my assumption is, of course, well, first that there is a difference, but then you would need to have a systematic comparison to see what the difference is, which is a bit emerging in one of the graphs that I showed. But also, I think different types of war, or how wars have been fought, will have different impacts depending on trust relations, depending also on how you define the relevant categories in that conflict. Of course, this might have been the combatants as such, or combatants connected to a certain ethnicity or nationality or whatever, and how this war has been fought. Because of course, I said, in general, war is about trying to control the population, but how you ultimately do that can also differ a lot. So there are, and this is about, ultimately what the ultimate horizon or goal is of the rebellion or the invading groups, or how you look at it. But what repertoires of violence are being used, for instance, is sexual violence systematically used, and another form of very intimate violence, some say even worse than that. So what, how this has unfolded, I don't think there is any systematic, or not that I know of, research on that, but it would be quite interesting to compare different ways that war is fought, and my assumption would be that trust relations would be very different depending on how these wars have been fought and what the relations with the population were. Regarding, indeed, so there are indeed, I agree, of course, programs regarding trauma healing. Whether I talked to, I followed a few of these programs, and I did also evaluations of some programs, but they were not really trauma, but there was a trauma dimension to it. And also there, if then I compare it to the gachacha, depending on how they were designed, I saw much more positive in terms of positive context and increase of trust coming out of these interventions than, for instance, the experience of gachacha. And so there are, I'm familiar with a few. You have social therapy, where precisely the focus is on the social tissue. I'm not familiar with Never Again or the specific programs in detail, so I cannot give any concrete insights on that. But I do know that there are a few, and I do see that some of them have quite positive effects. Yeah.
Time is ticking, so I'll just take two more questions if you could answer them quickly. There were questions about the slight decrease in intra-ethnic trust of Tutsi survivors over the years after 1994. Is there any information on why that is so? And then there was somebody who was also noticing that there had been a decrease in intra-ethnic trust between Tutsis currently, and if there was any reason or for that decrease in trust as well.
So the first was the slight slight increase for Tutsi survivors, right? Now,
decrease in intra-ethnic trust of Tutsi survivors the years after 1994.
A decrease of inter-ethnic trust.
Yeah, intra-ethnic trust.
Intra.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Why is that? Based also on my observations and the reading of the interviews, after the genocide, of course, the Tutsi as a group, and you see that also compared to Hutu, there was quite cohesive. Intra-ethnicness does not change during the genocide because, of course, the violence actually, it doesn't increase it, but it stabilizes the cohesion with people who have experienced the same thing. And also in differentiation towards what they have considered to be all the Hutu have, were how they started thinking. But over the years, and especially in the context of gachacha, some people started to see that people also, that among their group, there were also people who were not to be trusted, who accused people without having done anything, or that of people belonging to this category of survivors. Also, did not see the others as a sort of a cohesive group and automatically trustful, but based on actual behavior and the type of context they had. And you see a decrease in that level of trust. And especially in the context of gachachas, did I see that? Where based on that, they thought that some people actually are accusing people of things they haven't done, or some people, they're now actually accepting bribes of, let's say, people who have done something in the genocide and do not want to. So these types of dynamics were at play, which decreased the intra-ethnic cohesion.
Thank you so much, Bert, and thank you for coming today. Thank you for a fascinating presentation and for your fascinating research. I can see that there are quite a lot of questions still, but time is up, unfortunately, and that's usually a sign that your presentation has been very interesting. I would suggest that you look at Bert's website. It's www.bertingelaere.net, right? There you can find links to all of his articles and his books. And I'm sure that you can also send him an email if you have a more specific question. Thank you again, Bert, for coming. And for those of you who are interested in looking at what our past webinars, so this webinar will be posted to YouTube. If you missed the beginning of it, you can check it on YouTube later. But you could also go in and check our earlier webinars, Africa webinars, where our recent ones have been on the crisis in Ethiopia with international crisis groups, William Davidson, that you can find on the YouTube channel, the Egmont YouTube channel, but also one on pastoralism in the Sahel with Search for Common Ground. But today we say thank you so much to Bert Ingelaere, and thank you to the audience for asking interesting questions on a fascinating research topic. Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you, Nina, for organizing and having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.